We're going to start with the last session of our conference. So for those few still present here and kind of holding the front line, in this session we have three speakers. As you see, one is not present here physically, but is with us through video conference. So we have Iles here, János, Sugár, and Kluitenberg, who's I guess in Amsterdam, I guess, yeah? Okay.
Yes, in Amsterdam. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll first let Anthony speak, then János, and then we'll have a video that Eric was so kind to upload for us of his talk. And then we're going to have a collective Q&A session with Eric there on the big screen. So just a quick roundup of people's backgrounds. Anthony Iles is a writer of criticism, fiction, and theory based in London and Berlin. He is assistant editor of Mute, an online and quarterly print magazine, metamute.org, so editor of metamute.org, editor of the books with Matt and Noise in Capitalism in 2009, with, come on, help me.
Stefan
Żyżałkun, Agate Disco 2011, and co-author of, with Josephine Slater, No Room to Move, Radical Art and the Regenerate City in 2010, and a contributor with Martina Wischmer, the book Communization and Its Discontents. János Sugár studied in the Department of Sculpture at the Hungarian Academy of Fine Arts in Budapest. Where with his studies, he was actively involved in the exhibitions and performances of Indigo, an interdisciplinary underground art group. His work includes installations, performances, as well as film and video. Sugár has participated in national and international exhibitions. In 1992, he exhibited at the Documenta 9 in Kassel, and in 1996 at the first Manifesta in Rotterdam. His films were screened in 1998 at the Anthology Film Archives in New York. Since 1990, Sugár has been teaching art and lecturing media theory in the intermediate department of the Hungarian University of Fine Arts. He resides in Budapest. Eric Kluitenberg is a theorist, writer, and organizer on culture, media, and technology. He is head of the media program at the Bali Center for Culture and Politics in Amsterdam. He lectures and publishes regularly on culture, new media, and cultural politics throughout Europe and beyond. Since 1988, he has been involved as an organizer in important media culture events, much of whom have been mentioned here previously, such as the first and second International Symposium on Electronic Arts, ICEA, Interstanding 1, 2, and 3 in Tallinn, Estonia, the peer-to-peer new media culture in Europe conference in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, the third and fourth edition of the Next 5 Minutes International Festival of Tactical Media, Tulikomania.com, a critique of the new economy, Net Congestion International Festival of Streaming Media in 2000, and more recently the Dutch-Russian project Debates and Credits, Media Art in the Public Domain in Moscow, Amsterdam, and Yekaterinburg. The Amsterdam edition of the World Information Art, and the Manifesto and Archaeology of Imaginary Media in 2004, and most recently the Economies of the Commons Conference in 2008. So, Anthony, I'll just switch the audio back to you, so we won't hear Eric for a while. I think that your video got unplugged. And I'm going to ask you just to hold the microphone so that Eric can hear you. Okay.
Is it back up?
Yes, just push it a bit more with colors.
Okay, so I'm going to mix up a few different things. I'm going to give a paper which traces the history of raves, illegal parties and protests in its percolation through independent media. That's video, pirate radio, flyers, record labels, zines and small press. I'm going to, in a way, I decided kind of quite self-consciously to introduce a kind of personal history to this because I was at an event in Berlin last year or early this year, Transmediale, called The Death of Rave, and I found it kind of somehow quite frustrating the way that it was sort of dealing with the history. It was very nostalgic, very sort of psychologized, and instead I kind of prefer to give a material history, but that's somewhat filtered through my own personal circumstances and how I kind of found this, purportedly radical culture. And the point of sort of re-examining it now is that I think that the trouble with the nostalgia that was kind of present at this event in Berlin was it kind of clouded some of the more tangible and interesting threads which kind of still link, for me at least, to the present. So, and especially kind of one of the things that particularly annoyed me was the lack of any kind of discussion of kind of employment or kind of labour history or kind of a discourse of kind of work or work business, which I see is really central to that moment, both from a personal perspective and from a kind of cultural and structural political perspective. And I think it also has a lot to tell us about the present or kind of present, and present struggles. So I'm just going to start off, I'm going to play some music and show you some clips. This is just for the beginning of the track. Basically, I feel that I have to, having introduced the subject in this way, kind of give a tribute to the unemployed ravers. So I'll play you this. It makes some sense.
Hold it. I just thought I'd give a big shout out to all the unemployed ravers out there. You might not know it, right? You might not know it, but every week the government pays for your fucking parties, mate. So a big shout out to the government and all the unemployed ravers. Hey! Give it a tree. 90 freestyle with the mad bastard DJ in the console. The DJ who actually the detonator rocking these.
So this is from 1993. It's a club called Hybridised in Mansfield, which is near Manchester. So kind of original 19th century industrial heartland. By the end of the 80s, suffering huge unemployment, and by the beginning of the 90s, many of these kind of unemployed youth were spending their weekends dancing to very kind of fast, what was called in the UK happy hardcore. So you can maybe hear a little bit of that in the background. Kind of in 1994, I was 16. I grew up in the suburbs of East London, kind of border of Essex, a county called Essex. So it's the border of a very historic forest called Epping Forest. The town I lived in, Chingford, was a commuter town, and the train line went kind of direct to the financial city of London, so basically the kind of banking district. And that was the sector which, one of the few sectors in the 80s that had kind of seen big growth under Thatcher. Thatcher's government had kind of direct links to basically a kind of emergent sort of sector of the UK economy, financialisation, or what you could call the financial sector, real estate, insurance, and so on, and lots of subsidiary industries. This basically, throughout the 80s, Thatcher, in the interests of kind of restructuring the whole of the UK economy, directing it towards a kind of international finance, had basically kind of facilitated deregulation and facilitated conditions whereby the traditional kind of British industry, manufacturing industry, had been effectively looted by what we call kind of asset strippers, or what quickly became known as asset strippers. So these are actors on the markets, traders who accumulate capital, borrow from pension funds or from other sources, and then use that to buy up large industries, and then literally strip them of their assets. So effectively close them down or rationalise them, and basically kind of sell off the assets very quick at a huge profit. So they would kind of do this in like a matter of months. And this effectively kind of brought about kind of massive deindustrialization all through the 80s, but that was not where I grew up. It wasn't an industrial space anyway. It was a kind of suburb of London. It was quite green. The kind of, maybe 2 or 3 miles away, there were kind of spaces which had been industrial and were in massive decline. But beyond that was kind of the centre of London and these sort of shiny new NatWest towers and large banks and skyscrapers. So one of the, my kind of personal feeling at this moment at the age of 16 was a sort of desire to become something other than wage labour, and I kind of shared this with many of my kind of peers, to sort of rebel against the conditioning of education, kind of this sort of canalisation of life that would lead to this kind of routine travel into work in the city of London and back to kind of a suburban patriarchal home. So maybe I wasn't so sort of self-conscious about this in the same explicit terms, but there was sort of some sense that that wasn't what I wanted my destiny to be. So one escape for me was the forest nearby. Another was music to a certain extent. Another was catching a train into town and skateboarding with a small gang of malcontents. Occasionally in the woods, we would kind of, on the weekend, we would drink under the stars, and sometimes bump into strangers walking home from raves, from these kind of free parties which had begun to happen like on the periphery of London, outside of the M25. And we would kind of, sort of ask these people that we bumped into in the forest where they'd been, and we kind of didn't really have a conception. None of us drove at that point. We were sort of like, what is this? You went and you danced for 24 hours? Like, how did you do that? And, we were taking ecstasy or acid. It was kind of really exciting and interesting to us, but we couldn't really engage in this culture. This was kind of the age between sort of 14 and 16. And then we also used to have a kind of modest sound system of our own outside in the forest. And at the time, the kind of conflict there was between half of us who wanted to listen to kind of indie music like The Cure and The Smiths, and the other half would want to listen to this kind of new music called happy hardcore. And I was on the kind of indie side, but which is kind of interesting. But and that had a sort of class line in a way as well, which was quite interesting. So it's a sort of suburban situation. People were either going to private school or to state school, and most of my friends who I'd been with at a previous school, who were into happy hardcore, were all at this kind of state school, so public school. Anyway, I'm just having a bit of a struggle managing all these devices. One day, while I was still sort of, I didn't like this kind of very fast, kind of very hyper, sort of rapid kind of beats music. But one day in a car, in my best friend's car, a friend played me this track, and things turned around. So this was kind of a beginning of, it was quite interesting because it was a very sort of visceral experience. I subsequently heard this track like millions and millions of times in different clubs, on radio, all sorts of situations. But at the time I'd never really heard anything quite like this. And I I asked my friend in the car, oh, what's this music? What is it? He was like, oh, we don't know, we just call it, it's dark. And that's pretty much all he said. Kind of, subsequently you could kind of understand this as what was called, became to be called jungle, or also kind of drum and bass, and effectively it was kind of a combination of this kind of very rapid beats, happy hardcore, with like a much slower kind of dub, kind of under kind of bass line, like very strong bass lines, kind of spooky or sort of slightly sinister samples, and also, yeah, this kind of breakbeat. So just a few slides. This is Jeremy Deller's quite famous artwork, where it's an English artist who basically traces the connections between this kind of emergent dance culture. And he actually connects it back to, this was part of a project called Acid Brass, where she got a kind of mining towns band to play kind of classic house tracks with a kind of brass band. So you can kind of see acid house sound systems at M25 raves. So the M25 is a massive, very controversial circular road which runs around London and effectively kind of shuts off the inner city from the suburbs. It was kind of hugely opposed by various protesters at the time. It was seen as like another kind of Thatcherite attack, a kind of demonic kind of attack on the environment. These are just some flyers which give you a bit of a sense of this kind of like actual material media of how people were circulating information at the time. Often the flyers would have kind of maps to quite obscure locations. This is quite far East London, Glasgow. And yeah, they very rarely had kind of political valences, but sometimes a bit of something quite urban about kind of this is roadblock. It gives you some idea, you know, the names are quite kind of ethereal and kind of almost like based around it. So Labyrinth, Sundance, kind of things like this, sort of like vaguely psychedelic. Interestingly, the UK scene had kind of picked up on this Chicago house scene, and they'd heard the term acid, and they assumed it was LSD. That was the kind of common term for LSD in the UK drug culture. But actually, acid, it's about kind of pressing the record. It's about basically kind of copying in Chicago lingo. It means to kind of rip somebody off. It's called like an acid burn. When you basically steal someone's kind of sound by pressing it on the vinyl. This was also something kind of in the mix. Like at the time we were kind of finding protests from queuing for clubs. We would kind of be buying drugs in the queue, but also people would be handing out flyers for other parties and other nights. But also for protests as well. Or record shops, squatted spaces, finding pirate stations like Touchdown, Defection, Pulse, Rush, by simply spinning the dial of the tuning dial on the radio. And this was this was actually very close to where I grew up. This was in Leighton or Wanstead. It was basically part of another road process around the M11 Link Road, which is essentially kind of driven straight through the centre of like a small kind of stuff. So yeah, what happened was like this large road extension was passing through this kind of small village, which had kind of been incorporated into suburban London, and a group of road protesters, travellers, kind of hippies, new age travellers turned up and seized squatted this old emptied row of houses and began to kind of barricade it and build structures on the roof. So they were there for about a year and a half, and this was kind of like very much in our local news. And it was also a kind of moment where this kind of travelling subculture, this sort of dropout culture was beginning to kind of connect up with this early rave culture. So actually these people would kind of visit and go and chat with them or hang out in the street, and then they would kind of tell us about parties when they were having parties, but also about raves happening in the city. Yeah, there was this kind of sense that
Is this Reclaim the Streets or was it before?
this was before. So in a way, if you know about the history of Reclaiming the Streets, this was in many ways like the precursor. It's where a lot of the people who were involved in Reclaiming the Streets met for the first time, and also began to have an idea that this time it was like very hardened activists who were kind of locking on to these houses, like basically kind of using D-locks to kind of barricade themselves in the house and connect themselves physically when the builders came. But they also were kind of in touch with this party culture and began to sort of think or form ideas that maybe that could be used politically too. And there's also this very, for me it was kind of, I suppose this is the point that I want to stress, that it was kind of immediately political. It immediately kind of opened my eyes beyond kind of suburban, quite canalized kind of culture, and the kind of experiences that I would have at raves was just just like very different kind of, you meet people from a very different background, in my case of a very different age. Gender relations were completely different. It was none of this kind of sort of like sexy dancing on the dance floor. It was much more like people had their space, they weren't rude, they didn't bump into each other, they were extremely friendly. And you would also see what's quite interesting about the kind of transition for me, particularly, is like fairly recently I read this amazing book which is written by an American. It's about the kind of UK football hooligan movement, which was like very much something that was very present where I grew up in the 80s. Skinhead culture could be quite, racist, violent, kind of homophobic, and you would see kind of characters like this walking around the kind of neighbourhood. By the kind of early 90s, the same characters, you see this guy on the left, he's kind of very much from this culture. What happened is that kind of football hooliganism, this kind of enormous violence, this kind of pre-arranged fights, which would happen on the weekend, many of the kind of football hooligans began to get involved in illegal raves and going there, and less interested in violence, began to mix with began to be in a milieu which was kind of very kind of mixed racially, listening to this music which was a complete kind of mashup of dub, hip-hop, techno, and started to take these kind of euphoric drugs and appeared to lose interest quite rapidly in going and beating people up on Saturday. So that was quite positive. But at the same time, there's a kind of very ambiguous aspects about this kind of unleashing of new energies, this kind of accelerate. I mean, you could sort of say this, both the music and the dancing is kind of characterized by kind of acceleration, flexibility, and to a certain extent this kind of idea of panic. So you hear a lot of like sirens in the tracks, kind of alarms, often sounds extremely kind of noisy and crazy. People were using police sirens sometimes at raves, so you wouldn't know if like the place was being raided, and it really was being raided. And it's also a little bit maybe underlooked, that it wasn't, although there's kind of this euphoria going on, it wasn't a total kind of pacifist scene. So at parties like this was a fairly famous 1994 party. What you see in the background is Canary Wharf. So this was kind of Thatcher's landmark project for the Docklands in London, and this was like one of the, I think the highest skyscraper in London at the time. but all around the Docklands, basically completely destroyed community there, completely destroyed the old docks. There was lots of kind of industrial rubble. There'd been a kind of crash in the late 80s, and effectively, although Canary Wharf was up and running, it was pretty much empty, and most of the buildings were empty. So there was like plenty of kind of wasteland for people to set up sound systems and party. That was, that's another story. So but what happened here at this particular rave and many others was that the police would turn up and people would physically fight them. Quite often these raves are as big as like 25,000 people, so the police didn't, if police could see that people weren't up for stopping the party, they couldn't really do very much about it. But I'll go into a little bit the kind of criminalisation which happened next. But first, I just wanted to pull out a quote from Howard Slater's post-media operators text. Like Clemens talked a little bit about the term post-media operators, and this was kind of, I talked about sort of how I was kind of finding things through, finding media through different media. So one of my really important experiences was going to a record shop called Ambient Soho to look for some records that I'd been hearing at these parties, and I found a record, this record which was put out by Howard, which So Howard ran a zine called Break Flow at the time, and he used to put out writing which was kind of commentary on both kind of this, in a way, this kind of new music scene on techno music with reviews, but also kind of longer texts on theoretical texts on things like Proust or like Deleuze. And so through that, I found Howard's writings, and this kind of key text, which is still very much a key text around me. He says, post-media activity is not the outcome of a discursive resolution which would lead only to another discourse, but is the process that allows contradictions to be pushed in the direction of enigmas and provocative allies. It allows for experimental positions without coordinates. It drifts off the map, flees from forced identification and forced subjectivization, and takes with it the masks and tools that would enslave it. And so auto-theorization is a constant vigilance, a controlled loss, a permutability of the rational and the unconscious, a processing of the self-revealing social process, being both screen and projector, receiver and sender, silent and voluble, being the margins of a centre that doesn't exist. It occupies a liminal position that, in continually being dispersed, coincides and overlaps with a post-media practice whose overall rhythms are broader, a breath that can turn to history and precursors. So it's a sort of sense that it's not really, although, by showing a clip at the beginning of this kind of tribute to the unemployed ravers, it's sort of kind of wanted to make the point that there are explicit traces of a kind of politics or political reference. There are kind of moments of the kind of identification of material conditions within rave, but also this is very much a culture that worked through anonymity and worked through secrecy for kind of very good, very much, both practical reasons, but also in a way aesthetic reasons. So there's a sense that the kind of it's not just a kind of a signal that's being received. It's also kind of noise as well, and a context, and a kind of an energy, and that kind of energetic seems like almost one of the most important factors of it. And that kind of ran through all the different media, so it was involved. So what was it gonna do? Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to just briefly show a clip, which is also quite a well-known film in the UK. I don't know how well-known it is here. It's by a video maker called Mark Leckey. How many people have seen it? Just one? Okay. So that's good. It's worth showing. So what Mark Leckey does is he kind of mashes up footage from Northern Soul all-nighters, which was also a kind of youth subculture in the 70s, and he kind of relates that to, intercuts that with rave samples from techno, and also some really amazing footage of early raves. So this is like this kind of 70s dancehall, this kind of northern soul dancing. And in a way, he's kind of pointing to what you could, or what journalists is kind of called, Simon Reynolds, who's kind of called the hardcore continuum. I mean, in Mark, that's kind of like some very interesting journalism, kind of connecting all these musical genres. It's actually, in a way, Mark Leckie's innovation to kind of stretch that further back in time to kind of northern soul. And I think there's a kind of the title of this is Fiorucci Made Me a Hardcore. Fiorucci is a kind of Italian kind of brand, as far as I know. And there's a kind of interest in, I think, from Mark Leckie in kind of fashion culture, which maybe was like a little bit there in rave, but it was also, broke the system. But also, it's maybe not, for me, not so important, the fashion stuff. So that's just my computer is technically not up to scratch. So just have to let it cool down for a second. So in a minute I'll show you a picture of the first ever demonstration I went on, and this was kind of direct result of going to a rave when I was 16. I received some flyers which were like, there's going to be an outdoor sound system on Saturday, go here. I kind of was probably quite confused about what a demonstration was. It was kind of like, so this sort of probably fight for your right to party or something along that logic. That basically was announcing what became a really, really huge protest movement from 94 to 95, which was the anti-criminal justice bill. So basically the criminal justice bill was a new bill brought in by the Tories and the Conservative government to directly kind of address this kind of moral panic over kind of illegal raves, but also kind of criminalised travellers, both old school travellers, gypsies, and so-called new age travellers. It kind of had some impact on picketing as well, in that it was about the right to assembly. It kind of attacked the right to assembly. So it was sort of worded in such a way that if you were meeting with some intent, if a gathering of more than 100 people was meeting with some sort of intent, either to have a political protest or to make a rave or a picket, they could be arrested on the spot. So it's also quite crucial for the police to find a way of managing these kind of illegal parties, because they had to kind of capture and stop them while they were small. I just need a few seconds to second up. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay, so back to the criminal justice bill. Okay, so this is maybe a better picture. So, this was basically, yeah, as I said, so this was the first protest I ever went on. I was completely, kind of, I guess I knew something from TV that demonstrations usually have people with kind of banners and placards and with a kind of clear message. It was actually completely opposite. It was a total mess. There were like sound systems the whole way along. Most of the people, often people had like small kind of battery operated sound systems or bicycle operated sound systems. Huge amount of people with dreadlocks, wearing kind of scruffy army clothing, drunk by kind of, and out of it on drugs by kind of 11 at the beginning of the march, and it kind of carried on, people like dancing, jumping on cop vans straight away. We kind of got close. I think the idea was to walk to Parliament, so it's quite kind of long route. By the time we got to kind of Hyde Park, there was kind of the beginning of a standoff with the police, and then like a pretty full-on riot with like force charges and everything else. This was extremely exciting for me as a 16-year-old.
Which year is this?
So since like 1994.
Okay.
This is a little quote from a group called Arkzin, and their kind of estimation or summary of the movement in 1994. They said the movement may be considered in some ways paradigmatic of class struggle in the era following the retreat of social democracy, unhindered by any powerful mediating force, and as such both relatively incoherent in its attempts to express its demands and potentially explosive. We seem to be moving towards a situation where the traditional means of recuperation of struggles and integration of its subjects, the left, is finding itself increasingly incapable of representing struggles occurring outside of the productive sphere. The retreat of social democracy is itself a consequence of new global realities. So throughout the 80s, you'd had high unemployment, to a certain extent a kind of a general cultural refusal of work in Britain, a kind of attitude of like, why should we bother? A recalcitrant working class who'd fiercely opposed Thatcher's reforms of the welfare state and also the destruction of industry, in order to allow her cohorts in the booming financial industries to asset strip public services and manufacturing. Many people were thrown into unemployment, council housing was run down, vast swathes of real estate was empty, and this led to this lively subculture supported by a reasonably healthy kind of unemployment allowance at the time. Both literally living or squatting in the material devastation left by Thatcher's measures. After her reign ended in the 1990s, the Conservative government remained in power under John Major, but kind of economic stagnation set in, so this kind of brief kind of release of capital which she managed to achieve kind of pretty much petered out. And so what seemed to be a kind of conscious decision was to kind of like attack this subculture and attack these kind of non-working kind of youth, and basically kind of re-division the class, kind of discipline and re-partition the class. So I think, I mean, what's to connect it to now is that in many ways the kind of debates at the time, or it's quite actually, I'd say, underexplored at the time, this kind of whole issue of, I suppose, yeah, what theorist Michael Denning has recently kind of named like wageless life, or surplus, in Marx it's surplus population, is the term that he used. Michael Denning talks about how the decimation of the unemployed, of the so-called reserve army of labour, as Marx called it, was to be called back into active service, whereas the kind of destination of wageless life or kind of waste is the waste yard, the rubbish heap. So that he talks about the kind of production of human waste, and I think that this is there's a kind of continuity with the present sort of production of like how the ways in which people are kind of thrown out of a wage. So rather than a kind of refusal of work, it's actually capital that insists that we accept precarious, flexibilized work, or we're kind of severed completely from access to wealth at all. So there's kind of no, total kind of reneging on the welfare state guild, and kind of any sense that like you'll be kind of kept in waiting for a future employment. And in many ways, this kind of the 90s, and that's why I'm quite interested in going back to this moment in the 90s, is that it marked the beginnings of a period of the reimposition of work. So you could see the shifts that Thatcher had made to kind of begun to make from the industrial empire to a globally networked service, for the UK to become move from being an industrial empire to a kind of globally networked service provider. By the 90s, this kind of transition and this kind of moment of rave and technoculture were kind of part of a whole combination of technologies, spaces and income, which had kind of been the outcome of Thatcher's devalorisation. So Thatcher's kind of wasting of existing capital was kind of sort of creative destruction, as many people called it at the time. And I don't think that Thatcher would have minded being, associated with Schumpeter either. So in many ways, the kind of vinyl, radio, loudspeakers, trucks, the empty buildings, these were kind of the technologies and the media of a period of industrial production and mass culture. And they kind of, since they weren't in production anymore, they weren't in this kind of circuit of capital, they were just kind of available, they were just kind of abandoned for people to kind of access and appropriate. Just a bit addled. So basically the Criminal Justice Bill was passed and became the Criminal Justice Act. This is quite a funny little nod to my earlier musical taste, because this is Morrissey of the Smiths saying, "Heaven knows it's all illegal now." This is like a riff on a song which was "Heaven knows it's miserable now," which I quite liked. And something about the rave culture is maybe also kind of slightly forgotten is this kind of cheekiness, basically. This was another fanzine called Boyzone, which was actually, like, interestingly, both a kind of football fans magazine and a sort of acid house techno culture zine. It also had a bit of a kind of gay crossover, and I also bought records from their label before I kind of knew about the fanzine. They did a very classic kind of, and this maybe illustrates my kind of point about the kind of availability of media. So there's a famous Sniffing Glue, which was a punk zine from the 70s, had a kind of learn these chords and now start a band. Like that's, so he did a kind of rip-off, or revisitation, a kind of rip-off appropriation of this. So here's a sampler, here's two decks, now go to form a band. And that was, actually it looks quite annoying, but one of the really nice things about the first track I played, the Origin Unknown, is that you can see, and this is the nice thing about the way people upload media, this kind of historical media to YouTube, is it's usually just a label. And usually these records didn't have covers, they were kind of styled as white labels, they just had kind of like blank covers and then just the label. And on the label you can see that it was put out in Hornchurch in Essex, which is like about 2 miles from where I grew up. So there's kind of also, although I was myself and my friends were making music ourselves, like we would kind of know people at school or have older friends of older brothers who were making music on computers. We hadn't really seen a computer maybe at that point, maybe a ZX Spectrum was kind of technological capabilities. Yeah, so, okay. So this, yeah, maybe this is quite important. So sort of fast forward a little bit, I kind of, you know, immediately left the university, found myself unemployed, and kind of, you know, did various kind of precarious, flexible jobs, began kind of studying again, and in 1999, my kind of tutor took us to this space in Hackney called the Info Centre. This was run by Jakob Jakobsen. What you see on the kind of wall directly behind is a group called the Autonomous Astronauts, a poster by them, moving in several directions at once. They were kind of one of their members was called Jason Skeet. He was also a kind of music producer. You see like a number of zines on the table, which are like the zine data side, which was also very important for me, finding other writers and finding kind of theory and text, kind of text both about the sound system culture, but also in a way crossing over into kind of continental philosophy and theory, situation stuff, and a big tub of beer. So basically this is homebrew beer, which the couple who run the space, Jakob Jakobsen, Henrietta Hayes, basically it was just a kind of open project room. It didn't really kind of had exhibitions, but they were often just kind of reading spaces, just kind of moving kind of displays of reading material, kind of hard to find subcultural zines, kind of political magazines, texts and so on. And then they would simply, you would receive a kind of a flyer from them, and it would just say a date and we have brewed beer, and they would just kind of invite you to kind of informally hang out and chat. Yeah, okay, I'm not going to get very far, so okay, trying to think what's the most important. So just to kind of summarize, maybe, if I might. Yeah, so media. So I wanted to kind of bring this right up to date and play you a lot of music. I haven't really had the opportunity, but I'll try and think through how I can kind of just wrap things up. So again, kind of bringing work back onto the agenda. This and bring that together with this ambiguity around tactical media or media per se. This was extremely disturbing phenomenon in the wake of the autumn 2011 riots, which happened initially in London and then spread all over the UK. There were kind of like several social media organised kind of counter-propaganda or kind of like pro-criminalisation responses, largely from a kind of worried middle-class perspective. In this one, as far as I can see, it was the kind of title was called Reverse Riots, and people were supposed to kind of upload, use the hashtag and upload pictures which would kind of give a positive message. And I think this is like particularly kind of disgusting in light of this idea of like wageless life, is that actually without any possible entry into a job market or any kind of promise of like a good wage or good conditions for work, people were just like simply affirming work in a totally senseless way. So just saying like, I work hard, it's like kind of some sort of bizarre neoliberal stickanism. So that was one thing. So I'd say that just in kind of to maybe, I was kind of try and bring this into some of the forms of technology, but also the kind of use of music and kind of poetry and forms of speech that kind of tended to spread around the kind of recent mobilisations, both the riots that we saw in London, but also in a kind of connection with media and culture and kind of music culture. The situations we've seen with mass mobilisations in North Africa, Europe, US, South America, and West Africa have kind of grown this existing stability of means use, uselessness, misuse, contingency, chance into question. Sort of in a revolt, or in these revolts explicitly, people use whatever is available. Use itself, like the very concept of use, is changed. As in William Gibson's famous dictum, the street finds its own use for things. This means that the revolts of our time are increasingly seeing the suspension of normal ordering of objects and behaviours. New relations come to the fore, and they find their material to hand. New uses derive from and extend these new and unforeseen relations. You could talk about kind of impure, you could talk about means, and you could talk about these kind of impure means, like people don't seem to mind where they get these objects from, but they know what to do with them. So whatever gets employed, whatever carries, what gets picked up, what carries and distributes the signal is the media. So it was kind of a year ago, or a year and a half ago, or maybe longer, Transmediale was making the argument that the bread was the most important media of the Arab Spring, and it was also the most forgotten. So it began as a series of food riots around the price of bread in Algeria. That being the beginning, we spread to Egypt. People were kind of using bread as helmets, they were using bread as weapons, they were using them as kind of placards, and that's partly what it means, that there's a kind of crucial material kind of referent to the beginning of those protests and the crucial material need, but actually prices were too high and people couldn't eat. And to a certain extent, the discourse of social media and that importance kind of glossed over that. So, to a certain extent, you could pose the question of the ownership of media completely differently. Since all media, in even the conservative sense, are products of our labour, I mean, ours as in those who work. So, it's clear that capital both ruthlessly appropriates this labour, but also socialises it. It does this, however, in ways that suit the accumulation of value and not in ways that enrich us. We literally don't usually get to enjoy the fruits and wealth of our labour. So it's just, maybe it's a shame because I think I've lost the sound, but I also wanted to kind of talk about kind of social form and talk about the relationship in a way of, I think, what I was trying to reflect on looking at these images of rave is like, what is that? Is that kind of, does it have some sort of relationship to this kind of restructuring of work, to this kind of new sort of flexible model? Is kind of going out and completely expending your energy, completely making yourself useless for taking so much drugs? You're like more or less a zombie for work. Is that kind of resistance to work? Is that kind of desubjectification? Is it kind of a kind of response to the alienation of this kind of white-collar work, the fact that you're kind of more or less brain-dead, you're doing these kind of repetitive, regulated, conditioned tasks? Is it an attempt to kind of break out of this sort of, this kind of sense of the subject as just a congealed technology, like the effects of its moulding? But maybe we can leave that to the questions, but I'll just try and play this really amazing clip, which, again, I don't think we'll be able to hear the sound. Yeah. I think my sound card's just broken, but you have the subtitles. So this is the Ultras. This is Ultras Alawi, who are returning from Port Said, where there's been this kind of awful massacre, state-organised massacre of a football ground. They're kind of known as like one of the most militant fan bases in Egypt, and they're also quite famous now for having taken part in the initial Arab Spring, being some of the most militant, confronting the cops. They have a history of violence against the police, a history of drawing violence upon themselves from the police. And this is, in a year and a half after the initial occupation of Taksim Square, they'd begun to develop incredibly sophisticated kind of songs and hand gestures and kind of synchronized kind of dancing, singing, political forms of speech, which are kind of maybe, you could relate to this kind of human microphone, but also something I see as like a very interesting, they're also kind of drawn from a largely kind of workless suburban youth. And I suppose a kind of interesting thing about like this extraordinary kind of energy that can get unleashed within crowds, and also kind of uses this mixture of networked technology, but also to spread, the kind of plan of how to do these things, but also to a certain extent to reflect on them and spread them further. And they're kind of clearly addressing themselves, but also addressing a much wider circle of global audience. So that's, I'll finish that.
Anyway,
Just deal with the screen of the machine.
that's what I did.
Can you just do the detection?
Hmm?
Can you do the detection, display detections? Detect space.
Sorry, yes. Fantastic. Anyway, let's see. Fine. So I was really impressed by Book's presentation, and I put together a short, low-budget PPT.
Make it a bit more complicated.
Yes. Here you see an art historian, Benjamin Buchloh, just kissing Laura Sweiner. And Benjamin Buchloh is pretty well known, and he wrote about conceptual art. And the only reason where I'm quoting him because he wrote an essay, and in this essay he says that conceptual art existed between 65 and 69, and since that it became a kind of an unconscious for all artistic productions. And I think it's an excellent example or a metaphor we can use for let's say, new media, because the term new media appeared in the early 80s, and but the ways of expression it is referring. It was referring first, were at that time at least 130 years old. It was photography, the technical image, and in that time, in the early 80s, a new phenomenon appeared. This was the communication and digital communication. The first personal computers, 81, 83, appeared. And since that we can say that we could retro project this medial consciousness, so we can reinterpret other genres from painting to talk and lecturing and those situations. And this is the reason I'm not reading my talk, because it's not a lecture, it's a text. This ship of Theseus. It was published on the NetTime, and you can find it on the NetTime, and you can find it on the website or in the brochure Tom sent out. And I decided to speak about something else, and probably I can make a small detour and going to the conclusions which I'm using in this text. So what we call new media is something. Those are the tools which were developed by bodies who were interested in basically making money. So it's and that's why they were motivated by the competition and the quickness. And they don't really know all the facets, all the aspects, all the consequences of the new gizmo. And this is true from telegraph to photography, from film to video, and since those technical devices appeared. This difference that we have a tool and we don't know we can use it for in one way, but the tool is much more powerful as and that difference is let's say the starting point of technical media. And a couple of years ago I wanted to make some order among the notions and the topics I was interested in. And I developed this idea of PST, public street tactical. And originally I wanted to put street art in a rational context, a context we can interpret better than usual. And here you see the first sketch I made about this concept of PST. The first arrow is the public art, which starts with public monuments. It's pretty obvious that every society, every civilization has a need of institutionalized public memory, and the power can use it and abuse it very well. We have lots of examples, and the main medium for this is sculpting, public sculpting. It's perfect for the power because it's expensive, because the materials the monuments are using are noble materials, expensive materials, and that's why it's very easy to control. And of course, it's legal. The origins of street art, maybe we can see this. It's a painting from the 17th century made by Rembrandt. It's in London, and this is the famous feat of Belshazzar. It's in the Bible. Maybe you know it. An invisible hand, the first invisible hand in the history of the Western civilization, appeared and wrote something on the wall of the feast of Belshazzar. And this is of course illegal, and illegal message appears. And then this is the second arrow, making a mark or expressing something which is not allowed, or giving voice to something which is repressed or oppressed. Let's say the third thing, it's much younger from the point of history, is the tactical media. That's why I mentioned at the beginning that we have powerful new tools, but we are using only a section of the options, the possibilities of those tools, and through the usage we can discover the tactical aspects of that particular tool. And now those on the right side you can see lots of notions. It's the public art in the sense of the contemporary art, and it's just a short list, but fanzines, graffiti, stickers, stencils, surveillance camera players, adbusters, hip-hop, extreme sports, urban sports, demonstrations, activism, culture jamming, etc. So, to make this short, I would say that this is the situation now. So all media which we are using became tactical, because now the users, we have this experience that we can do something different. I mean, we can abuse our new tools, and we can discover new possibilities with that. And this is the idea. Last time when I met Eric, we spoke about this. That first I thought that maybe we can introduce a new term, media art 2.0, because the first let's say wave of media art could be very easily interpreted on the tradition of conceptual art, because the tools, the equipments were closed-off units, like a video projector, a computer, or some mobile applications, and the artists are used them in this or that way. Let's say we can mention many names, but if you are familiar, I'm just mentioning Jeffrey Shaw and Peter Callas. I'm mentioning Peter Callas because he is an excellent artist and not really well known in Europe. He's Australian. But anyway, It's a funny coincidence that Anthony just spoke about the party culture, and there's a new wave, the next wave of media art, which is parallel, which comes parallel with a new concept of devices, because we have, on one hand, we have very interconnected devices. So this is my actual problem, that the operation system in my laptop is 4 years old, and my telephone, on the operation system on my telephone is 1 year old, and they are not compatible. But especially from the party culture grown up a new generation, and for this new generation to hack the machines is an everyday experience. And there are some other developments, let's say grassroots developments, producing little devices which are not closed-off boxes we have to connect and they are working or not, but they are adaptable devices like Arduino and Kinect and then all those stuff, and they start to work with them. I have a quite close experience because some of our students where I'm teaching, they are really deeply in this sort of activity, and it's not that media art we knew earlier, which we can see eventually in museums and media art installations, interactive installations, etc. It's something else, not just from the point of technology, not just from the point of devices, but the general attitude, the approach of the whole technical environment is completely different, and I would like to call it a tactical approach. And with the tactical media, and that's what we spoke about with Eric last time, there is a similar development, because the users are much more experienced. And most of the users, they know already that our tools and machines, we can figure out how to use in a different way, and this different way, it's my screensaver, but actually I like my screensaver. It's okay. It's in brackets. I'm working on a particular artwork, and this is the, let's say, which is before the beta version. It's not even the beta version of it, and it's the screensaver which brings up images in a random order. And I'm very much interested in the fact that we as humans, we have a default ability that we try to connect things we face, we meet, and we try to interpret them. And those connections, even those images, which are per definition random images, we can interpret in some way, we can read them. But anyway, I go back to the PPT. It's, yes. Okay, so we can also put the same way of thinking what I described earlier concerning the media art. It fits also to tactical media. So we have a lots of new services like the social media, which is in itself. I mean, for every user, is a sort of it forces the user to see it in a tactical way. And I'm just saying, and that's what I'm saying, that we can introduce this tactical media 2.0, which connects this new sort of media art, or this evolution of media art, and this new kind of tactical media. Because this new kind is this new approach to tactical media comes from the desperate situation because of the crisis, quite simply. And my text, which I'm not reading now, you can read it, and that means that we are really using this situation of lecturing in a very efficient way. Is my reaction to that rhetorics of crisis I wanted to understand, and the core of this in this text is the fact that capitalism, which is in the system we are living in, this is the market economy and representative democracy cannot really work any longer. And capitalism has two main characteristics: is accumulation and growth. If there is no growth, there is crisis. By the way, there is a very exciting new theory of no growth, décroissance. So the economists try to look for a new solution, which might be this no growth. And the only thing that people have to understand that there is no growth any longer, and they cannot consume in the way they did until now. And it's okay, I mean, it's absolutely not okay, but capitalism is in a crisis. The problem is that it's not just, it's a very complex system, and these two characteristics, the accumulation and the growth, has penetrated all the areas we are living and the whole life. The personal level, our new drug, I mean, not really new. It's let's say the new drug of the 20th century is efficiency. That we are so efficient, we can communicate in a very efficient way. We can do things in a very efficient way. We can be fragmented in order to be even more efficient. We all know this. So if you have a switched on mobile phone in your pocket, like all of us have, that means that we are not completely present in a situation because we can all the time interrupt it. And this way of thinking penetrated modern art also, the concept of modern art. I have a, yes. Okay, so the big circle would represent the big system, the general system. This is this market economy, and this is this practical, efficient way of thinking. And it started somehow in that form in the 19th century. This little dot in the middle is modern art, because modern art in that concept is a counter system, an anti-system, a system in which things could happen or things could be interpreted in a completely different way. A little counter system which could allow some contradictions as well. And the system of modern art is the system of over-interpretation. And now this very sophisticated, very high level, very important system of over-interpretation is in danger with the crisis of the capitalism. Because we can see, I'm coming from Hungary, and Hungary is a miserable situation now, so it's really a shame. And of course the Hungarian government, the very conservative rightist government, has a concept on art. But this is just a very provincial version of what is going on in other areas in the West, in the so-called Western world. And this is the concept of creative industry, which is made by the British Labour Party or some people around the Labour Party. It's a very well elaborated concept. You can find some references in the Wikipedia. And the Institute of Network Culture, led by Gert Loving, published a freely downloadable publication, My Creativity. I suggest to everyone to read it. What's the problem? The problem is that overinterpretation gives us a very special experience. Because in the first moment, there is something I cannot understand. And on the other hand, I can understand this. And this process from not understanding to understanding is pretty typical to modern art. And the over-interpretative environment is doing this. So maybe, I can mention tons of examples, but maybe the best, or not, one of the best examples is Mary Kelly's work. She is a very important artist, and she did an exhibition back in the 70s, I think late 70s, I'm not good with dates, and she exhibited the dirty, shitty diapers of her newborn baby. And you can imagine the reactions, and this over-interpretative environment of the institutional framework defended her. Explained it, and somehow could give or find an interpretation which is nowadays accepted. And this work is canonized in some way. So you can see in a big Austrian collection, and sometimes it's exhibited, and it's a very important artwork. So what I'm saying is that modern art has a very important function that which could lead people. In the concept of modern art, the artist is asked to do something non-understandable, something strange, something non-transparent, because the whole big environment around art is completely transparent. It's the practical word. If it's not transparent, we cannot use it, we cannot live in it, we cannot work with it. And there is a little counter system in which the laws, the things are working in a different way. So, a modern artist are allowed or asked to do something completely strange. The most important is that it shouldn't be clear, transparent. In the first moment, it can be strange, unusual, subversive, whatever you want. And the environment, this over-interpretative environment, can explain it and give an interpretation. And
modern art means 20th century, or is it still
yes, practically 20th century, but it started earlier because when
I just want to know to when.
Because it started with autonomous art when the big narratives were disappearing. There was no religious or ideological, let's say, expectations toward artists, and the artist became an individual and with individual responsibility. And the significance of this process is that we have, so it's not because art is such an exceptional that we have to support artists, and we have to allow them to do something stupid, and then we will love it. So it's not about snobism. I think it's something very clear, because every big system could be really efficient only if there is a counter system in which the things are different. Practically, there is a so-called free speech area where everything is allowed, and this is important from the point of facing new problems, of facing a crisis, of facing a black swan. That's why is it there, and because only with this ability, if we are accustomed that and we have this experience, that there is something I cannot understand, like a crisis, like another person with a different skin color, or a completely new situation I can have, I can't have references from the past, so I'm somehow alone and I have to solve this situation. It's very interesting when the space travel started, they put a very strong emphasis on the creativity of the astronauts, because it's a situation we can figure out lots of things in advance, but that's for sure that there's going to be something which you cannot predict, a so-called black swan. So if the question is, if this whole system, the big system, is collapsing, and the big system doesn't want to support this over-interpretative environment, then this function, this ability of the civilization will be weaker. So we have less able to solve new, unusual situation. And this is also a trend that infantilizing people in order to make them easier manipulate. So and this very sophisticated system, which I described before, created lots of new approaches toward art. So we are not surprised if in a museum, in an art gallery, there are no artworks, but the artist is cooking, or someone is talking, or something different happens. And since the 70s, there is a very strong movement of leaving the so-called white cube, leaving the so-called sterile and neutral space work, and going into the public space. And what is in the public space? The public space, on one hand, there are the monuments historically, and there is a new trend from the side of the politics and the commerce, which developed the concept of creative industry, and this is a sort of a clash, because the creative industry's concept is that creative people have to market their creativity, and it can be happen in different ways, in positive ways, or in not dangerous ways, or not. But in general, the concept is that the artist has to fulfill something which is defined by the power, either the commercial power, if someone is a talented, I don't know, PR expert or graphic designer, will be asked by the Coca-Cola and doing an excellent ad campaign. That means selling his or her creativity. And this is pretty much the same with other areas which are a bit closer to the contemporary culture. So there are lots of public art programs which aiming an intervention in areas where there is some social problematic areas where there are some social tensions or some negative changes in the life of the people. So concerning going back to the tactical usage of media, I would like to show you just some examples. It's a street art piece in Hungary. By the way, it's made by one of our students, and in my interpretation, it's let's say the tactical usage of graffiti anyway, so I don't have to speak too much about it. Another example, this is quite fresh, it's from Istanbul. It's also the technical interpretation of the environment. It's extremely interesting that they are writing also on the boardwalk and not just on the usual surfaces. And this is what I like very much. By the chance, it's very close to my studio in Budapest. A street artist statement on design. It's another work of that guy. He has invented a new genre of graffiti that called trash graffiti, because graffiti has historically, I mean, one of the most important element of graffiti is the fame, that we have to do something on a very visible place and eventually dangerous or controlled space. And the trash graffiti is moving out. It has some references to the hippie movement. They walk around the city. Usually they walk in the rust zone, and they do things in abandoned spaces, and they reinterpret what the traditional graffiti artists used to call toy. Anyway, I'm checking if I'm showing something. Yes. So I didn't want to run out of time, and that's why I wanted to tell everything in a hurry. But again, I think it's yes, maybe this one. This is a piece a student of us did. And I'm showing it because it has some reference to the actual Hungarian situation in terms of culture. You know, this is the famous logo of critical mass, when such a figure is holding a bicycle, and of course it's the bicycle wheel of Marcel Duchamp. Okay. Yes, actually, thank you. I finished, but it's a question and answer section, and I have a question. Do you know what is this? I found it yesterday here.
It's
No, it's so I guess it references that Gracia is for sale, because that's the first Grecian king, and kind of is identified with nationhood. So
Supposedly the same intervention was made at the pedestal of the statue at the main square yesterday, but I haven't seen it myself.
Hello. I hope you had a really good conference so far this day. I looked at the program and that made me particularly sorry that I can't be with you in Zagreb at this moment. We will be able to talk with each other live via Skype in a couple of minutes. But in order for this to make the presentation remotely a bit more lively and entertaining, I prepared this little video which summarizes the main things that Tom asked me to talk about. And basically what Tom asked me is to go back to a text of about a year ago called Charting Hybridized Realities, which was building on a network notebook exploring the legacies of tactical media. And in this crowd, I assume that I don't have to explain what tactical media is as such, which I had written shortly before that text, and which explored the legacies of this phenomenon, tactical media, that emerged in the 1990s, and then somewhat disappeared, but seems to have received a new urgency in the light of various recent developments that we'll go into in a minute. This is a little bit the starting point to go back to that and to relate it to the current conditions. But the current conditions are really quite different as to where we left them off when, particularly in Amsterdam, when my involvement was through the organization of the third and fourth edition of the Next 5 Minutes Festival of Tactical Media, and the conferences that were connected to that, where we left it off basically in 2003. And I want to go back just a little to the time before that led up to this event. And this image might be familiar to some of you. It is an image that comes from a book of Critical Art Ensemble of 2001. And 2001, for obvious reasons, is a very symbolical date for all of us, but for tactical media in particular. And they wrote this book, Digital Resistance. And there is this enigmatic image of this man holding up the sign. He seems to be something of a walking billboard, but there is this slogan superimposed by any media necessary. While in the background we see an entertainment district in a major North American city, which presents us with theaters as well as light displays saying fun, games and murder, which is of course a typical fusion of heterogeneous elements in the entertainment industry that bring in the tension in this image, because murder is neither a game nor is it fun. So this image can be decoded in various different ways, but what struck me about it, in particular in relation to what Critical Art Ensemble are describing in Digital Resistance, is that it's an urban street scene. So this picture seems to give the urgency even still to the street. But in the book, Critical Art Ensemble make this ominous claim that became quite famous, that the streets are dead capital. Essentially, and I've heard Steve Kurtz make this point also in various settings and conferences and so on, the claim was that these embodied realities were no longer the locus of power. This had all shifted to the information and media domain. As Kurtz summarized it, that power had shifted to the symbolic realm, and therefore intervention had to also move to the symbolic realm. Symbolic intervention in an era where the symbolic is the locus of power is immediately and directly an intervention into power itself. That was the claim that Steve Kurtz was making at that time, and which famously was also reiterated in Digital Resistance. Now, this book is about tactical media, and also already was mentioned in the book by Critical Art Ensemble. This was a very uneasy term because it brought together very different practices from a variety of rather different backgrounds, a kind of transdisciplinary practice that also actively resisted, as they said, to be named. So it didn't want to be named anything. The term tactical media basically emerged out of the first two editions of the Next 5 Minutes Festival in Amsterdam, coined by David Garcia and Geert Lovink, of course, and others who were involved in the really early editions in 93 and 96, in the period also that led up to the famous text of Garcia and Lovink, the ABC of Tactical Media. So much about this term, tactical media. Okay, so I was tracing this while writing this network notebook, Legacies of Tactical Media, and we started with this idea as early as 2008. Then we had to collect money and so on. So the real writing got underway in 2010. And then slowly something started to happen late in 2010 that even took me quite by surprise, I must say, and that taught me a lesson about how your preconceptions about something can be really wrong, because my preconception was not so much that the streets were dead capital, but much rather that the symbolic intervention had run most of its course, that somehow this media activity had become so mainstream after 2005, after the emergence of massive video platforms such as YouTube, Vimeo and others, but also with the massive rise of blogging and of course nowadays microblogging, this kind of self-produced media for any purpose, and most of it, what we see today, is non-political, doesn't have the aspirations of tactical media, but it had become such a mainstream activity that we can really wonder how can they still retain this kind of aspiration towards social change, political intervention, contestation, real interventions into power. Maybe this happens here and there in temporary moments, but the real force of it has basically dissolved in this sea of mediation of the self that happens in all these kind of self-produced media, but loses its particular political edge and relevancy. So here was a big question that I was exploring, thinking that, well, yes, here and there the legacies live on, we can learn from the past and we can refine certain specific actions, but also only in particular local contexts, in a particular situation in which they can be deployed. But we cannot take any kind of general claims anymore that we have a new type of political power that is vested in the symbolic intervention through the media means. And then, of course, 2011 unfolded. And I'm also referencing that in the text, but also in the network notebook, because while I was writing, this thing started to happen, which we can now retroactively name a little bit, which can be called the movement or movements of the squares, where the question still is very much out, are there real movements, or is there just a certain pattern that we see emerging that starts to repeat itself? But we saw this convergence of two heterogeneous force fields. On the one hand, the occupations of public squares, the street protests. On the other hand, the massive deployment within these protests from the very start and even before in the mobilizing process of these kind of self-mediating tools and techniques across a wide variety of media platforms. Not just social media, but all kinds of media platforms, and also locally distributed and redistributed platforms. as well as through massive connections between different activist groups in radically different political circumstances, in radically different cultural contexts. Quite interesting that suddenly there was this resurgence. And where it started more or less in the Middle East, we saw a lot of popular protests against authoritarian regimes. It seemed to replicate itself in Southern Europe, where for years there has been already a debate about precarity, the precarization of daily life, and which really connected itself to the whole austerity question and youth unemployment in Southern Europe. While in the US, we saw, of course, the question, will America see its Tahrir moment, as Carl Larsen of Airbus has called it, in his call for Occupy Wall Street, and where a variety of different activist groups, but also a lot of individual citizens gathered in the different public square occupations that became Occupy Wall Street and all the other occupies that we saw throughout the US. And then it replicated itself again to Northern Europe, and it had again a completely different agenda. So what we see is not so much one movement as more a pattern. And this pattern is really interesting. And the one thing that cannot be claimed within this pattern, despite the deep involvement in these kind of self-mediating techniques that always characterized tactical media, is that the streets are that capital, because they clearly aren't. So before going there, I would like to make a slight detour and go back to 2001 once again to explore the landscape that we were in at that time, when these questions about the power of the symbolic were emphatically under question. So it's interesting that digital resistance came out in the same year that the 9/11 attacks happened. And it was in this context, this transformed landscape, this hyper-violent landscape that we were suddenly thrown into in 2001. And I remember when the attacks happened on the World Trade Center in New York, I was actually in Croatia, interestingly enough, in Pula, and at another media gathering. And we watched these images in disbelief, as many people have watched them in disbelief in different situations, but everybody remembers where they were at this particular moment. And the one thing that was so striking about these attacks was that they were so absolutely mediagenic. You know, the date was symbolic. The site of the attack was hyper-symbolic. It was basically headquarters of economic globalization on the Western agenda. The attacks looked like a Hollywood disaster movie unfolding, and very quickly were absorbed into this media narrative, flattened out. Klaus Teweleit observed even that it was turned into a video clip within days, and there was this strong mediatic dimension of it, so much so that this symbolic intervention was immediately seen as by someone as prominent as Naomi Klein in a very famous article called Signs of the Times, which he wrote about a month after the attacks. For The Nation in Canada, she said, you know, after these attacks, we can no longer proceed with the symbolic intervention techniques. We can't do culture jamming, local hacking, and all these kind of things like we did before. The symbolic intervention is completely corrupted. She literally said the semiotic landscape is utterly transformed, and it is corrupted by these hyper-violent crimes that you basically use a vocabulary that was very common to the practitioners of culture jamming and even tactical media practitioners that often create on these kind of symbolic moments and symbolic sites. and forms to convey some kind of counter message. So it's really interesting that we were in the middle of this corrupted semiotic landscape in this debate that was going on about how the streets had lost their relevance, critical art ensemble, but then also the symbolic was entirely corrupted by these mediatic attacks. So where to go from here? This is really the big question. And it was emphatically on the question in the last edition of the Next 5 Minutes. We organized a series of so-called tactical media labs around the planet. Local organizers put groups together, and we did it from the 11th of September 2002 exactly to the 11th of September 2003, and then a few days later was the final festival where all of this was coming together, and there was no real final conclusion about this at that time. Just that there was a sense that somewhere these practices had seemed somehow to lose their clear orientation. Now, we can jump again across this in-between time. I wouldn't say that nothing happened in between, but it is amazing. We were flooded by these kind of images. This guy in particular struck me because he has written on his head "free people," which is maybe free the people, or people who are now free, liberated. In this case, of course, Egypt, from the fear of the Mubarak regime, finally able to go out on the street and protest, even though that was very dangerous and quite a few people lost their lives. Here, the street of the People's Assembly, this guy has transformed it into the People's Street. So we have these kind of images that kept on flooding us. It wasn't just the videos, it was certainly not the mainstream media reports, but it was these kind of particular visions. And what was also interesting, of course, is the recurrence of this iconographic scheme, this kind of Bob Dylan type of holding up the protest sign that kept on replicating in all these images. So typically you see this kind of visual cliche continuously repeated over and over again as you watch these events unfold. But what for me was really striking was that most of these images that circulated, and some of these that are in the background, circulated massively across the internet. So I'm sure most of the images will be familiar to you, actually. But that's the point. They were massively circulating, but they were not made by professional media producers. They were made by just ordinary people. And there is this excitement, this continuous excitement in these pictures, this gaze, the gaze that I wrote about in the network notebook, into infinity, into something other, something beyond. And I couldn't really put my finger on exactly what is going on there. So, given that this is non-professional footage mostly, non-professional images, that really define the image for a larger crowd of viewers, passive viewers, there is a kind of subjectivity that is constituted here. It's not a professional, media professional view on the events. The subjectivity that is constituted here is certainly also not an artistic subjectivity. The artist is still a professional, in my view, and not somebody who expresses a merely, in brackets, personal view. There is a subjectivity here that is constituted, that is quite different. And are these people naive? I don't think so. Do they think that they can be completely unfettered in their sort of genuine personal vision of these events? I don't think so. I think they are very aware of their incorporation into larger systems, their commodification in the event. and still they pursue it. And I started to articulate this notion of subjectivity, and the term that I came up with was a perverse subjectivity. This was not derogative, it was a very positive designation of what it was that we were observing. A consciousness of your own commodification, of your own co-optation, and still completely submerging yourself in the event. Now, while this was a very interesting way to look at it, something still seemed to be missing that I couldn't quite formulate at the time when I was writing both the network notebook and this text, Charting Hybridized Realities. And I think this is the mix that comes in now, the element that comes into the mix that has to be brought in to understand what is actually unfolding on the streets, as these streets, through this massive deployment of wireless media and self-mediating techniques, themselves become media networks and media platforms. So the platforms are not just the social media, it's the intersection between these different flows of information, images, of impressions that we need to analyze in details. This thing that I usually refer to with this concept of hybrid space. So a space, one space that is constituted of all these different flows. The final thought that I wanted to leave you with before we go to the Q&A is something that I'm exploring right now, which builds upon the work done for the network notebook and other texts that followed it. And this is this question of this beyond that I'm talking about. So what is this beyond, this gaze into infinity? What does it try to connect to, or what is driving people in this beyond? And there's been a number of different publications. Recently, the most important ones are not Manuel Castell's networks of outrage and hope of this year, and Paulo Gabardo's tweets in the streets of late last year. And both of these put strong emphasis on emotions as a kind of driving force and a connective force in these protests, in these movements of the squares, if we would like to use that naming. However, both of them miss something that I start to consider more and more crucial, and something that we can discuss further in the Q&A. It might be interesting, because I think both of them fail to address the question of the non-conscious, of everything that is beyond consciousness, but that is very much tied to this bodily gathering, to the kind of exchanges that happen in these extremely densified spaces where people are closely together. But there's also this continuous presence of all these media flows going in and out of this space. I think that these kind of flows that are happening there, processes that work beyond consciousness but influences, resonate, are incredibly important in shaping the connective pattern that we see emerging over and over again.
Well, I might venture a nice paper. This has been really a tour de force of archaeology. Archaeology of the media. What I find interesting, maybe going back to Eric's talk, is that the subject that you describe as perverse seems to me that is also a subject that is, through the use of media, trying to make a claim to the historic significance or to mediation of the events unfolding, trying to reinscribe them in sort of social experience and give them broader significance of already posterity of the events as they are unfolding. So in that sense, it is kind of anticipating the historic significance and trying to make a claim. Obviously, all of these events that we follow unfold do have quite strong political charge. For instance, over the last couple of days, whoever has followed feeds from Istanbul could have seen sort of a tide of these sorts of images. But what was interesting for me was also to see a number of fakes that were there. So there was kind of already a way of trying to make it bigger than it was. For instance, there was the image of Istanbul Marathon that was posted as the image of people crossing the Bosphorus, whereas there was the actual, later probably, actual images of people, quite a few of them, not as many as in Marathon, but still for many other contexts, really quite a few people crossing the bridge. So I think that's what kind of urge there might be. So it's not only claim to the political power, but it's also claim to history. So that's my comment and question.
And just to give a brief reaction to that, it is indeed more a comment, and I think that it's a good comment also. So this claim to history is quite interesting. I think the fake is also really interesting, and that connects maybe more even to what I was talking about, because I think that the riots in Taksim Square, whatever scale they have right now, they seem to be quite significant in the local context. So one of the recurrent comments which you keep on hearing, which I find really interesting, is people saying that a lot of people, especially young people, become politicized for the first time, that they are for the first time exposed to this level of police violence against mostly peaceful protesters, that it's introducing them into certain realities that they probably knew were there, but were, quite reluctant to think about. And at the same time, you feel very strongly that the whole Taksim Square situation is very much interpreted in terms of the Tahrir Square experience, and even staged to some extent in terms of the images that we saw there. And this is a problematic situation now, where in the very self-conscious tactical media discourse in the late or in around 2003, let's say, when we did the last Next 5 Minutes festival, there would be immediately these discussions about commodification, and therefore a kind of inability to move forward because of this discussion. What I find interesting in these popular outpourings of dissent is that people have found a way of transcending it, and they found a way by just doing it and accepting this level of commodification. And on the other hand, that is of course the really essential component here, by going out into the street and meeting with others. So you get a completely other configuration. And what we didn't have in 2003 was this massive deployment of wireless media. And you see this feedback loop appearing now. And this is what happened in Tahrir, it happened in many other places where people, whether they're on the internet live or not, that's not so important. They have their mobile devices, they record the video, and they stage themselves even as protesters. That's also a recurrent comment that you find. the mediatic is immediately translated into the physical through this physical gathering in the streets and squares, but then the streets and squares and this gathering there is immediately mediated again on a variety of different platforms and circulates in all kinds of different ways. And we get a very complex feedback loop in which rather unpredictable dynamics occur. And they occur not just in political protests, but also in other forms of this type of energetic gathering. So this is where I find a new dynamic unfolding, which I think is only half understood at this moment. So I'll leave my comment on the comment to this for the moment.
I think that there's probably an interesting parallel between what's going on in the patterns of the streets and the raves that Anthony was giving an account of. I keep on thinking of Judith Butler's commentary to this, where she said that something to the fact that why this is occurring is for reasons that it's the people's livelihood. Housing, access to work, access to care, unemployment benefits that are being dismantled currently, and that people being there physically and having routines that revolve around the physical and the reproduction of everyday life, that they are direct effect of the character of the crisis. So I think that this kind of can be, from your account, Anthony, be also related to the way raves function. Obviously, the political charge or potentiality was very different. It was more retreating from the center of political, sort of the eye of the storm, and more finding your own place and space. But how do you? What's your view?
Yeah, I think it's quite mixed up, because to a certain extent there were elements there were elements of society which kind of posed the possibility of reproduction outside of capitalist work, and also to a certain extent outside autonomous from the state. There was also certain tendencies which kind of posed proposed fighting the state for resources like better welfare conditions, and also this kind of conquest of space, like taking space, just in a temporary way from parties, but also in a kind of longer term. There was a very large squatting culture, so if you squat a house and you live there, you don't need to pay rent. You've immediately kind of solved an aspect of your reproductive problem. But I think also, in a way, the thing that to me is somewhat like the kind of temporary spatial occupation and forms that these kind of square occupations are taken are very similar to raves. They're very similar to like small festivals or kind of mini festivals. They're just kind of unending. It's like not clear when they will stop. They don't have, usually you go to a festival and you have a beginning date and an end date. In a way, the rave culture broke with that, and they never, often didn't dictate when they were going to finish. But so there's some sort of similarities like that, but in a way, I think there is something, as Eric points out really well, about this kind of overlapping of media and overlapping of kind of hybridity of space that's going on, which to be in a square is to also, kind of be visible, and to be, even if the government isn't interested in supporting a polis, anymore, the people might have something to gain by pretending it exists. I'd say that the kind of materials that I'm looking at in the UK, it's just like that space doesn't exist. Nobody, even after the late 80s, nobody believes that the polis exists. There is no public space. It's like you take space. You never ask permission for demonstration. That didn't happen for like 15 years. None of those movements asked for permission. So I think there's a mixture of that. Some of that, but also there is some sort of sense that you're producing a public space through images, through videos, through kind of public speech acts, and I think that's kind of interesting. János, do you want to?
So, I don't know. There are no other comments. It's rather late, so I'd like to thank to our last presenters, Anthony, János, and Eric, and thank you all. So round of applause.